I'm Pastor Mark Buetow, and this is another Higher Things video short and another episode of Bible 101. So, we've got God's people, the Israelites, the people from the tribes of Judah, and the other tribes too, living in the land of Babylon. Now, God gave them the promised land, but in their idolatry, He had thrown them out, and so they were no longer living in the promised land. Well, now what? Well, God is still faithful, and He's still taking care of His people. A couple of the stories today and next time we'll talk about are coming from the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel tells us about some of the young men who became rising stars in the land of Babylon, but more importantly, those through whom the Lord worked to bring His judgment not only upon the nations, but to spread His word even to the ends of the earth. In this case, Babylon, and later on the kingdom of Persia. So, in the land of Babylon, the Babylonians say, hey, let's take some of these bright young Hebrew kids and we'll turn them into government officials. We'll make them experts in our laws and all these sorts of things. And so they do. They take four guys. They take Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And they say, well, look, let's give them, first of all, let's give these Hebrews Babylonian names. So they call Daniel Belteshazzar, and they call Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they say, listen, we'll train you, we'll give you the finest foods, we'll give you all the best benefits of everything, and you'll grow up and be great men in the kingdom of Babylon. And they say, no, we don't want your stinky, unclean food, we're not going to eat it. And of course, the guys in charge of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel say, wait a second, you got to eat all this food, you got to be trained, otherwise you're going to get sick and die. And they say, no, the Lord will take care of us. And so all they ate was like vegetable stew, and the Lord did bless them. And they became wise, and they grew in their knowledge, and the Lord blessed them to become great men in the kingdom of Babylon. It's like the Lord's own agents in this foreign kingdom. Well, of course, the native Babylonians didn't like that. They got jealous. So they told the king. They came up with a plan. They said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, live forever. Here's our plan. Build yourself a giant golden statue, and whenever we play music, everybody has to bow down to it." Well, they knew that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego weren't going to bow down to that golden statue, and so that's exactly what happened. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they heard the music, didn't bow down. They refused to yield and to worship this false god. And here's what happened. It's not that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the other Hebrews weren't loyal to their king, the one who was ruling over them at the time anyway, King Nebuchadnezzar. It's just that when you start saying that the king is God, when you make an idol, well, the Hebrews are not going to bow down to that idol because you shall have no other gods before Yahweh, before the Lord. And so they wouldn't do it because that, well, is an example of what got them in trouble in the first place, and they refused to do that. But because they knew and trusted the Lord's promises to take care of them. So even though Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are great men and they're wise men and they're way up there in the government of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar says, I can't cut you any breaks, guys. I'm going to give you one more chance. Bow down to my idol when the music plays or you're going in a fiery furnace. Which is not exactly a nice way to die. They built this furnace and they heated it up so hot. He said, you know what? Make it 7 times hotter. Nebuchadnezzar was furious that these men wouldn't bow down to his idol. And so they threw Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in there. In fact, the furnace was so hot, it killed the guards who were tossing them in there. And there, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would meet their end. Or so the king thought. And they had confessed that to him. They said, you know, king, you can throw us in the fiery furnace, and either the Lord will protect us, or we will perish according to His will, but we're not going to bow down to a false god and an idol. Well, then Nebuchadnezzar looks in the furnace. He says, wait a second. Didn't we throw 3 guys in there? How come I see 4 guys in there? And sure enough, he says, I see one that looks like the Son of Man or an angel or something in there. Could it be that our Lord Jesus Himself was there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, protecting them from the fire and giving a witness to the testimony to King Nebuchadnezzar of who the true God actually is? And so the king lets Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego out of the fiery furnace. Not a hair of their head is singed. They don't even have the smell of smoke on their clothes. The Lord has protected them. And finally, Nebuchadnezzar says, wow, now I know there is no true God except Yahweh. And so Nebuchadnezzar really becomes a believer in the true God because of the witness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so we see how the Lord preserves his people and spreads his word and demonstrates even to the people of the nations that he is the true God. It's a story we see repeated over and over, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, and even in the days ever since in the life of the church, that Christ has promised to protect his people. And though we won't always be taken out of this world and its suffering, yet through suffering and through persecution, the Lord always watches out for his own and gives to them the promise of everlasting life and the crown of everlasting life. And so we see how the Lord preserves his people and spreads his glory and name abroad, even outside the land of Israel, even when his people aren't in the land that he promised them, because the Lord is being faithful to his promises and always looking out for his people. I'm Pastor Mark Buetow, and this has been another episode of Bible 101.